And now to the biggest mystery of our times. Where did the Wuhan virus come from? The broad answer is China, but where in China? Was it a wet market or a lab? Did it jump from animals to humans? Was it leaked by human error or worse, intentionally? We don't really know. The pandemic began 3 years ago, and there has been intense scrutiny by multiple agencies over the past many months, but we don't have clear answers. Now, American lawmakers have set out to change that. And the role of Dr. Anthony Fauci is once again making headlines. Last month, a U.S. agency gave its verdict. The U.S. Energy Department declared that the Wuhan virus came from a lab leak. Now, American lawmakers are holding public hearings on this. The Republicans are leading this effort. A subcommittee of lawmakers held public hearings. It has both Republicans and Democrats. And they're digging into details, trying to establish what happened in the early days of the pandemic. Experts have been asked to testify, and among them is Dr. Robert Redfield. He's a former director of the U.S. Centers of Disease Control, the CDC. He's a former director. The CDC is the National Public Health Agency of the U.S. Dr. Redfield served as director during the Trump years, and he believes a lab leak, quote unquote, most likely started this pandemic.
I still believe today that it indicates that COVID-19 more likely was the result of an accidental lab leak than a result of a natural spillover event. This conclusion is based primarily on the biology of the virus itself, including the rapid high infectivity for human-to-human transmission, which would then predict the rapid evolution of new variants, as well as a number of other important factors, which also include the unusual actions in and around Wuhan in the fall of 2019.
Dr. Redfield doesn't dismiss the theory of natural origin, but he leans towards the possibility of a lab leak. And this has been his position from the very beginning. But what's the basis of this assertion? Beyond the scientific possibilities, he also points to some events in the run-up to the pandemic. And this is about the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the very same Wuhan lab that is at the center of the lab leak theory. Consider what Dr. Redfield said, and I'm quoting, "In September 2019, 3 things happened in that lab. One, they deleted the sequences." This is very important, listen carefully. One, they deleted the sequences. That's highly irregular. Researchers don't usually like to do that. Second, the second thing they did was they changed the command and control of the lab from civilian control to military control. That's highly unusual. And the third thing they did, which I think is really telling, they let a contractor redo the ventilation system in that laboratory. Let me repeat. Sequences were deleted, the military was called in, and the ventilation system was changed. These are some highly suspicious events, according to this expert too. So was the Chinese regime trying to hide something? Don't expect Beijing to answer that question for you. Meanwhile, Dr. Redfield had more to say in his testimony. He said the Wuhan lab indulged in potentially dangerous research. I'm talking about the gain-of-function research. It involves altering a pathogen in a lab, which is done to potentially improve its ability to cause a disease. That's gain-of-function research. Dr. Redfield said the Wuhan lab was doing this kind of research. But did the same research cause the pandemic? Dr. Redfield does not rule out the possibility. He also spoke about the role of Dr. Anthony Fauci, the controversial face of America's pandemic response. Dr. Redfield was still the director of the CDC when this pandemic began. In the early days of the pandemic, when the question of the origin came up, Dr. Redfield said he was sidelined for his views. Why? Because Fauci and team did not want to discuss the lab leak theory. Let me once again quote from Dr. Redfield's testimony. This is what he said. "I was told that they had made a decision that they would keep this confidential until they came up with a single narrative, which I will argue is antithetical to science." So did Dr. Anthony Fauci try to silence the lab leak debate? He denies the charge. He says Dr. Redfield's accusations are, quote unquote, completely untrue. So now it's a war of words between two experts, and China is watching closely. China does not like any discussion on the lab leak. Earlier this week, Beijing had this to say.
For some time, the US has insisted on politicizing, weaponizing, and instrumentalizing the virus tracing issue. It has made up lies and fallacies, such as biological weapons theory or lab leak theory, without any evidence.
Why does Beijing get so worked up about the lab leak debate? Because the story is not dying. China has stonewalled investigations. It has denied access to the Wuhan lab. It has refused to share any evidence with the world. For the longest time, it prevailed on the World Health Organization, but now the WHO says there should be a probe in China.
I wish to be very clear that WHO has not abandoned any plans to identify the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. Contrary to recent media reports and comments by politicians. In 2021, WHO established the Scientific Advisory Group for the Origins of Novel Pathogens, or SEGO. In its report last year, SEGO identified key studies that must be done in China and elsewhere to verify or eliminate the various hypotheses for the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic.
So even Dr. Tedros is not singing China's tune anymore. And even though the question of origins has not been answered, far from it, the efforts in that direction are worth noting.